Rommel's dash to the wire was one of the most dramatic and disputed moments of Operation Crusader, a sudden eastward thrust that seemed to promise either Axis victory or Axis overreach. After the brutal fighting around Sidi Rezegh and the destruction of 5th South African Brigade, Rommel believed he had a chance to turn British and Commonwealth confusion into collapse. Instead of staying near Tobruk and finishing the battle there, he drove toward the Egyptian frontier, toward the border wire that marked the edge of British-held territory. The move was bold, unsettling, and dangerous. It forced 8th Army headquarters to confront a terrifying question. Was Rommel breaking the offensive, or was he leaving the decisive battlefield behind?
The dash made sense only in the context of the preceding crisis. By the 23rd of November, British armored formations had been badly worn down, infantry had suffered heavily, and the fight around Sidi Rezegh seemed to be slipping away. Rommel had seen British units battered and scattered, and his instinct was to exploit shock before the enemy recovered. This was the same aggressive command style that had made him so formidable in the desert. He did not usually wait for perfect information if he sensed that movement could unhinge an opponent. In mobile warfare, speed can become a weapon in itself, especially when the enemy headquarters is already struggling to understand the battle.
The wire itself was not a great military objective like Tobruk or Sidi Rezegh. It was the frontier barrier associated with the Libyan-Egyptian border, and it symbolized the eastern edge of the campaign. To drive toward it was to threaten the rear areas, supply routes, and nerves of the British Army. Rommel hoped that a sudden thrust toward the frontier might convince the British that their offensive had failed and that their own line of communication was in danger. This was classic desert war psychology. A column appearing where it was not expected could seem larger than it was, more dangerous than it was, and more decisive than it could actually be. The move also showed Rommel's willingness to treat uncertainty as an opportunity. He did not possess unlimited fuel, unlimited tanks, or perfect knowledge of British intentions. His army had fought hard and suffered losses of its own. Yet he believed that the British were shaken enough that one more blow might turn disorder into retreat. That judgment was not irrational, because Crusader really was in crisis. But it was risky because the British offensive had not actually been destroyed. The Tobruk garrison was still active, Commonwealth forces were still fighting, and Auchinleck's larger purpose remained alive even when the battlefield looked chaotic. Rommel's dash gambled that British will would break faster than Axis strength would run out. For the German and Italian troops involved, the dash was not an effortless desert ride. Tanks, armored cars, trucks, staff vehicles, and support elements had to move across harsh ground while already strained by days of combat. Fuel mattered with every mile. Mechanical reliability mattered with every hour. Navigation mattered because a fast column in the desert could create panic, but it could also create its own confusion. The image of a commander racing toward the frontier can sound clean and cinematic, but the physical reality was harder. Crews were tired, vehicles needed maintenance, and every move away from the central battlefield created new questions about supply and purpose. At 8th Army headquarters, the effect was immediate and alarming. Reports of enemy movement toward the frontier fed the fear that Rommel might be cutting into the British rear or threatening the whole offensive from behind. This was the kind of situation that tested headquarters more severely than a straightforward attack. If the reports were interpreted as proof of collapse, commanders might halt or abandon an operation that was still recoverable. If they ignored the threat, they risked losing supply areas or being struck in a vulnerable place. The difficulty was not merely tactical, it was mental. Rommel's movement attacked the British understanding of the battle. This is why the dash can look like genius from one angle and overreach from another. As a psychological blow, it was powerful. It spread alarm,
disrupted assumptions, and reinforced Rommel's reputation for appearing where he was least expected. As an operational choice, however, it pulled Axis mobile strength away from the ground that mattered most, the area around Sidi Rezegh, Ed Duda, and the approaches to Tobruk. The British offensive was wounded, but the siege had not been secured. If Rommel's aim was to finish the destruction of the relief effort, leaving the central battlefield created danger. A commander can win a local panic and still lose time at the decisive point. The dash also exposed the difference between raiding and operational decision. A fast movement into the enemy rear can frighten headquarters, scatter support units, and create headlines, but it does not automatically destroy the enemy army. To be decisive, it must cut supply, trap formations, break command, or force a retreat that cannot be reversed. Rommel's thrust threatened several of those possibilities without fully achieving them. The British army was alarmed but not dismembered. Its supply system was disturbed but not fatally severed. Its commanders were shaken but not all convinced that the offensive had to end. In armored warfare, the effect of a maneuver depends not on its drama, but on what it compels the enemy to do.
Auchinleck's role became crucial because he had to judge the difference between crisis and defeat. A less steady strategic commander might have seen Rommel's movement and concluded that Crusader had failed. Auchinleck understood that the offensive's purpose still mattered, and that Rommel's army might itself be vulnerable if it was moving away from the Tobruk battle. This did not make the situation easy or safe. It meant that British command had to hold its nerve while the battlefield seemed to be tilting. The ability to continue under such uncertainty is one of the least glamorous but most decisive qualities in war. Sometimes the commander who refuses to panic changes the outcome more than the commander who makes the boldest move.
For Cunningham, commanding 8th Army, the dash deepened an already severe crisis of confidence. He had watched the battle become confused, had seen armored formations suffer badly, and now faced reports that Rommel was striking toward the frontier. His uncertainty was not personal weakness in a simple sense. It reflected the immense pressure of commanding a new army headquarters in a mobile battle that no longer resembled the plan. But uncertainty at that level could become dangerous. If army headquarters lost faith in the offensive, the troops still fighting near Tobruk and Sidi Rezegh might be denied the persistence needed to turn survival into victory. Rommel's dash was aimed precisely at that nerve center. The British and Commonwealth forces on the ground did not experience the dash as one clean event. Some units felt its effects directly, through confusion in the rear areas, while others continued fighting near the decisive ground without a full understanding of what headquarters feared. This gap between frontline experience and headquarters anxiety is important. A unit under fire near Sidi Rezegh might know only that it still had to hold, advance, or counterattack. Farther east, staff officers might be trying to decide whether the whole army was endangered. Modern armored warfare stretched perception across space. The same event could look like a raid to one formation, a crisis to another, and a possible catastrophe to headquarters. Rommel's movement also raised a supply question that could not be ignored. Every mile east consumed fuel and time, and every mile away from the Tobruk sector made it harder to influence the battle that had originally drawn British forces into danger. Axis logistics were never generous in North Africa, and dramatic movement did not cancel material limits. A commander could drive toward the wire, but tanks still needed fuel, guns still needed ammunition, and damaged vehicles still needed recovery. The farther Rommel pushed, the more his boldness depended on a system that was already under strain. The desert rewarded daring, but it also punished commanders who treated distance as if it were free. In the end, the dash to the wire became one of the turning points because it failed to produce the collapse Rommel needed. It frightened and confused the British, but it did not end Operation Crusader. It drew Axis attention and mobile strength away from the area where the relief of Tobruk would still be decided.
It helped create a command crisis inside Eighth Army, but it also gave British and Commonwealth forces time and space to continue fighting around the corridor to the fortress. That is why historians can reasonably see the move as both brilliant and flawed. It was brilliant in nerve, but flawed if measured against the unfinished operational task at Tobruk.
Rommel's dash to the wire matters in the history of armored warfare because it captures the double edge of speed. Fast armored movement can shatter an opponent's confidence, strike deep into vulnerable areas, and turn confusion into opportunity. But speed can also seduce a commander into chasing psychological effect at the expense of operational decision. Tanks and mobile columns do not win by movement alone. They win when movement destroys the enemy's ability to continue. In Operation Crusader, Rommel's dash created fear, but it did not create final victory. The British offensive, battered almost beyond recognition, still lived. And because it lived, the desert battle would turn back once more toward Tobruk, where the question was no longer whether Rommel could shock Eighth Army, but whether Eighth Army could survive the shock and keep going.